Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is the Association for Mormon Letters annual conference. And we're here this morning with two sessions where we have some presentations two sessions with presentations with panelists giving us some good Mormon literary criticism, which I'm very excited about. I'm going to ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and then I'll talk a little bit about Eugene England and set up this panel, and then we'll go straight into them. And we'll start with Renan, and then Emma, and then Conor with their introductions. Go ahead, Renan.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Renan Silva. I'm from Olinda, Brazil. I have wrote some poems and short stories. And also I have translated some interesting things like the Estampas de Livro de Mormon, written by Gabriel Gonzalez, into Portuguese. And I founded a group on Facebook and now the association for Latter-day Saints writers here in Brazil. And it is my pleasure to be here with you today.
Hi, I'm Emma Tuellar. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently a PhD student at Cambridge in the UK, focusing on Mormon young adult literature, specifically by fantasy writers. So Orson Scott Card, Stephanie Meyer, Brandon Sanderson. I'm so excited to be here today.
All right, and I'm Conor Hilton. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Iowa. My dissertation is on Gothic stuff and 19th century British lit. So in the post-secular, and I dabble doing Mormon lit creative work and literary criticism, which is what brings me here today.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm very excited to hear what you all have to say. When I saw these submissions come in, I'm like, yes, let's do this panel here. So this conference, we are talking a lot about Eugene England and framing a lot of the work that we're doing, or framing what we're presenting during this conference in the context of Eugene England and his legacy. So much of his contribution to Mormon literature was around bibliographic and historical work, also his own writing via the personal essay. And he also did a lot of work building platforms for Mormon literature to flourish, like Dialogue and the Association for Mormon Letters. And then also a lot of his work with Mormon literature was editorial work, like Tending the Garden, which is a collection of literary or essays focused on Mormon literature that he and Lavinia Fielding Anderson put together. But sometimes Eugene England also did close readings of specific literary works or a set of literary works. One example would be Danger on the Left, Danger on the Right, The Ethics of Recent Mormon Fiction, where he took a look at 3 anthologies of Mormon short stories that were published in the 1990s, including one that he edited, and where he thought they went right or went wrong, went left or went right. Another example of a close reading that he did would be Past Watch, The Redemption of the Orson Scott Card, which he first presented at the Life, the Universe, and Everything Science Fiction and Fantasy Symposium. In this essay, England critiqued Card for what he perceived to be a Manichaean ethos or element to Card's work, which meaning it really focused on kind of strict definitions of good and evil. But in Past Watch, England saw some hope that novel by Orson Scott Card might represent him beginning to move beyond that Manichaean worldview. There are many other examples. All this is to say that among England's many contributions to the field include some fascinating close readings of works of Mormon literature, as well as some thoughts on what Mormon literature is and how we should talk about it. So I'm very happy that we have this group this morning to talk to you kind of in the same vein. And we'll go ahead and start with Renan.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you today. I will share my screen just a minute. I hope you could see it. Well, I want to start by commenting something that James Dark said in the article "The Mormon as a Vampire" in the View Studies, that 2005 was a centenary year for the Mormons in the movies, because that year they completed the century of the film A Trip to Salt Lake City by Thomas Edison, the first film of an historical generation of films about the Mormons, usually with satirical and critical tone, which includes the film Trapped by the Mormons, which has completed its first centenary this year. An adaptation to the screens of the novel The Love Story of a Mormon by Winifred Graham, a book in which James V. Dark, as James V. Dark tells us, a Mormon missionary is portrayed with vampire gifts that he uses to disguise his charlatanism in attracting converts, especially a young girl he intends to convert into his second wife. However, 2005 was not only the centenary year of the debut of Mormonism in cinema, 2005 was also a very important year for Mormon in art, as it was the year of the release of Twilight, the first book of a long saga written by Stephanie Meyer, which started a phenomenon in literature and pop culture worldwide. Vampirism has been a classic theme in Occidental horror literature since John Polidori's The Vampire, which pioneered the genre in 1819. In recent years, it has become evident that horror literature, including vampire literature, is not incompatible with the literary creation of Latter-day Saint writers. In fact, there is a great compatibility between Mormonism and vampirism, and what can be observed is that more and more saints have been interested in the subject, especially after the work of Stephanie Meyer. This phenomenon is also present in the Brazilian Mormon literature, since there is a certain literary production by Brazilian members of the church involving vampires. Although the Mormon literature does not have the same historical weight in Brazil as other literary traditions produced by Latter-day Saints, it has strong roots here with varied and quality content, including Gothic or vampire literature. In this brief essay, I will focus on 4 Brazilian Latter-day Saint writers who have published, among other topics, literary texts about vampires. All of them are members of the Brazilian Association of Latter-day Saint writers. The first is Christian David. He is a renowned writer from the south of Brazil who recently became immortal, but now he has turned into a vampire. He was elected as a member of the Rio Grande do Sul Academy of Letters, becoming one of the 40 members of this traditional literary academy. In 2007, he published the short story Rinaldo in a collective work. Shortly after, he republished this story in a book exclusive of his own tales, this here, with several stories of terror and mystery. And he also published a one-paragraph spin-off story of this story, Interview with Alice, in 2009. And to my knowledge, Christian is the first Brazilian Latter-day Saints author to write about vampires. Rinaldo is a very traditional vampire in the style of Count Dracula and who maintains a certain kinship with him. I don't want to give you spoilers, but the narrative is done in a missive tone where the character narrator is the journalist Lauro Leal, meets the vampire Rinaldo by chance and is invited to his mansion, where he discovers the vampire's secrets and this will torment him for the rest of his life. Alice, the spin-off's protagonist and narrator, is precisely the vampire's companion who was not transformed by him, but who maintains an almost surreal, passionate relationship with Rinaldo, whom she calls my hated nocturnal being, my beloved vampire. Of the authors I spoke with, Christian was the one who created the most traditional vampire or as he told me, classical, seductive, and selfish. Rinaldo, moreover, lives a dilemma common to vampires. He is immune to the passage of time. People, values, customs change, but the vampires remains the same. And this can cause him some suffering, as is the case of Rinaldo, who apparently seeks to overcome this dilemma by finding a female companion, human, however. This is, by the way, a second dilemma, also common in vampire fiction, where love between human and vampire is possible, or whether such a relationship could survive. When I asked Christian about the relationship between his literary writings and his membership in the church, he gave me some very interesting answers. He believes that his membership in the church and what he learns from the gospel influence his stories, all of them, but mostly indirectly and unconsciously, as it is inevitable that the writer's beliefs to be reflected in his literary creations. Now, I will refer to two authors together, Rafael Neves and Elise Lima, because I believe that their stories have a lot in common. Rafael's main work is The Vampire Kiss, and Elise Lima's main book is City of Vampires, which has a sequel called The Reborns. As I also want to avoid spoilers, I will make general comments about both books. These two books involve a romance between a human and a vampire, at least in the case of Agatha and Eric, protagonists of The Vampire Kiss, who are really human and vampire until Agatha is turned by Eric. On the other hand, in City of Vampires, the female protagonist, Stella, is not just a human, and the male protagonist, Lemon, is not just a vampire, as we believe at the beginning. Both books involve, in addition to the romance, an action story, a war between good and evil. In the case of Raphael's Vampire, the war is between different groups of vampires fighting for power, with one side defending that vampires should conquer the world and dominate humans, and the other defending vampires to keep themselves separated from humans. In Elise's novel, the fight is between vampires and angels, a fight provoked by breaking of agreements between the two groups. In both cases, there are cities that serve as strongholds for vampires. Villains who, despite being vampires, like the protagonist, having the sophistication and the seductive power of the protagonists. The vampire heroes hide secrets that the family companions gradually discover. And by the way, the female protagonists are very powerful and quickly develop fighting skills and are fundamental to the victory of their clans. It is interesting to note that these battles follow a pattern where there is a fight between good and evil, which Jeff Savage, author of Dark Memories, has referenced in a dialogue with Tracy in an article published in the Meridian magazine. This is the quote I will not wrote, but I showed this to these authors, and they confirm that horror stories can teach lessons in the triumph of good over evil. Rafael Neves even commented that terror, despite creating monsters and supernatural beings, also reveals, and for a certain point of view, denounces the true evil. And the third author is myself. I run a blog dedicated to Stephanie Meyer Twilight Saga, and 2 years ago, I wrote the short story, The Mormon Vampire, that have been published in Spanish and Portuguese. In this story, I narrate a curious encounter between a vampire, a member of a traditional lineage of vampires from the fictional Central European country of Hilton, and a member of the church, which will be the first Mormon in that country. The result of the encounter is macabre and the end is surprising. In this story, the vampire is driven by curiosity, not by thirst for power or thirst for blood, but for knowledge. His curiosity about the religion is the engine of the plot, and it takes him to the quite extreme consequences. Right in the story, I wanted to think about the possibility of a universe in which vampirism and the restored gospel would exist at the same time. And if it was possible for a member of the church to be converted in a vampire, or for a vampire to be turned a member of the church. The funny thing is that this never happened, at least not literally. So the vampire in the story is not a Latter-day Saint, does not he effectively become a member of the church. So for a lack of better name, I call him the Mormon vampire. Now I want to comment a little on Stephanie Meyer and her relationship with the phenomenon of vampirism and the impact of this in the Brazilian Mormon literature. Tracy Pinkston, in the article that I mentioned, say that some of today's best horror is being written by LDS authors. Among these authors, I believe that Stephanie must surely be, although she is not mentioned in the article. In fact, Stephanie is little remembered as a Mormon author. However, the truth is that Stephanie's literature brings a new mythology about vampires, their nature, powers, flaws, and also a new clash between the Mormon faith and supernatural, dark, almost demonic themes, like the protagonist Edward Cullen would say. All this with implicit references to Mormon doctrine, like with the word of wisdom, second coming, and the Heavenly Mother. Talking to the authors I mentioned, I was able to confirm an initial idea that I have, that Stephanie Meyer represents a certain landmark, a reference, more distant or less, more direct or less, about all the Latter-day Saint writers, and especially on those who write about vampires. And for all four writers I mentioned here, however, did not copy Stephanie's vampires model. Each other create vampires with different powers, weakness, and interests. But except for me, all three other authors have love stories involving mortal and immortal, as well as Stephanie characters Edward and Bella. And in the case of Raphael and Eliza's novels, there's also a struggle between good and evil, between different clans of vampires. These two novels also have strong female protagonists, just like the Twilight Saga. Stella, Agatha, and Bella have been turned into vampires by their companions and have supernatural powers that, as I said before, are critical to the victory of their clans. So Stephanie Meyer, while not a role model, is a common and general influence and reference among vampire writers around the world. And the Brazilian church members are not immune to their power. So to conclude, I want to refer to something that Orson F. Whitney said before his call to apostleship, and mentioned by Eugene England in the essay that is the theoretical framework for this conference. Elder Whitney says, "We will yet have Miltons and Shakespeare's of our own. In God's name and by his help, we'll build a literature whose top shall touch heaven. Through his foundations may now be law in earth." And I don't know if we already have a Milton or a Shakespeare, and I don't even know if we will ever happen. But I know that here in Brazil, we already have some Bram Stoker, some Mary Shelley, some Edgar Allan Poe, and some John Polidori. I also don't know if our literature from the Lusophone Mormons of the South will touch the heaven, or if one day it will be. But I'm sure that it's very firm roots below the earth. Therefore, I can say that even 100 years after the release of that movie, Trapped by the Mormons, the link between Mormonism and vampirism remains hot in the literary veins of Brazil. And I know that Mormon literature about vampires can flourish in any ground, even in Brazil. But luckily, Here, the vampires do not shine like crystals because it would be possible for them to hide for many hours under the Brazilian sun. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Renan. That was a fascinating look at something that I honestly didn't know a whole lot about. We're gonna talk about horror and the Gothic and vampires, I think, after we finish the rest of the presentations, because I have one observation and a couple of questions. But first, Emma is gonna present to us.
Hello, yes, I am. I do not have slides, so I'm afraid you will all just have to look at me for the next 15 minutes. And I do apologize for that. But here we go. Twilight was a phenomenon. For many young readers and realistically for older readers as well, it was a first encounter with fantasy, with romance, and possibly even with the Gothic marriage plot as a genre, and melodrama as a mode. Its popularity shows that whatever Twilight does with these different genre factors, it was widely and broadly appealing, starting a rush of young adult vampire novels that continue to proliferate to this day. In previous research, Mormon studies scholars have sought to draw connections between Twilight's innovative approach to young adult literature and Meyer's LDS heritage. An example of this is Margaret Toscano's paper on the subject. My aim today is to illuminate the connections between Mormon influences in Twilight and the extensive use of intertextual Gothic references within the series. The connection between Twilight's Mormon and Gothic influences is especially clear on two fronts: the persistence of absent mothers as a trope in the series, and the significance of a marriage plot, and the resulting importance of wife and mother as an identity in both Gothic romances and Mormon ideology, especially in what it means to be a mother rather than just a woman. Examining these elements of the series brings out a new context in Twilight, which shifts the positionality of monsters, damsels, maidens, and daughters in the classic Gothic narrative. These elements also raise pertinent questions about how LDS doctrines, especially the ever-relevant questions surrounding Heavenly Mother, can be presented in traditional literary modes. Ultimately, looking at Twilight as an example of what the Mormon Gothic for young adults could be illuminates both the religious and horrific elements of the text, hopefully providing a useful way to understand this much analyzed story. To do this, I will start by explaining some of the literary theory on the Gothic that I have used to interpret Twilight and its mothers. This includes theories of the female Gothic and the matrophobic Gothic, as well as their connections to young adult literature more broadly. Then I'll spend a bit of time connecting this to previous work about Heavenly Mother, as well as Mormon-specific analyses of Twilight that are useful to ground the many absent mothers. I promise I will keep this part as brief as I possibly can. Finally, I'll spend some time on the many absent, missing, and imperiled mothers in the Twilight Saga, and why they are important to understanding how Mormon theology and the Gothic novel interact in this specific text. My ultimate goal is to create a groundwork for defining the Mormon Gothic for young adults as a literary form more broadly as part of my PhD research, and I appreciate all of you for working through this with me. Before I get started, I also just want to make it clear that during this presentation, I'll be talking about issues of infertility and resulting prejudice, sexual assault, suicide, racism, forced sterilization, specifically of an Indigenous woman, parental death and abandonment, and the death of young children, which are all heavy topics. I have tried to handle these topics as delicately as I can, but also want to provide forewarning for anyone who is sensitive about these subjects. And now, without any further disclaimers, let's talk about the Mormon Gothic. In recent work about Gothic literature, especially Gothic literature written for children and young adults, there has been an intense critical focus on the role gender plays in these books, which has, in turn, become a focus on mothers. It feels important to say up front that in the context of Twilight, motherhood, femininity, and the biological processes of birth and menstruation, and those such things, are all equated in a way that does not necessarily parallel the realities of all women or all people who give birth. For this presentation and Meyer's work, though, everyone who gives birth or yearns to become a mother is a cisgender woman. And almost all of Meyer's female characters have complicated relationships with mothers. One way to describe the part that mothers play in the Gothic children's book is the idea of a matrophobic Gothic, as conceptualized by Deborah Rogers, which is an idea that essentially says that womanhood, as conflated with motherhood in any way, becomes a source of fear, disgust, and horror in Gothic fiction. The grotesque maternal body is apparent, according to Rogers, in a variety of Gothic classics. In Radcliffe's novels, haunted houses are equated with mothers' hostile and dangerous bodies that threaten to entrap characters in an unrelenting and inescapable womb. And Austen's Northanger Abbey examines the constrained role of women by satirizing Radcliffe's Gothic equation, saying women are trapped as wombs rather than simply in one. In Pamela, childbirth becomes both medical and religious horror, while for Walter Scott, the barren woman is monstrous in her inability to conform to the normative gender expectations and return to a comfortable normal at the end of the story. Another similar conception of this particular Gothic tendency can be found in Mower's idea of the female Gothic, where the relationship between spilt blood, creativity, and art often align. These ideas have been extensively examined by scholars like Jackson, Coates, and McGillis, especially in how they apply to Gothic literature that is written for teenagers, especially teenage girls. Gothic novels written for a primary audience of teenage girls encounter even more complicated questions of how characters interact with and become mothers. Camille Buckley argues that in a young adult Gothic, fear of menarche and anxiety about virginity take the place of more adult discussions of birth and psychological attachment to mothers. For Twilight, this can be seen in the many conversations Edward and Bella have about their mutual virginity, including Edward saying he wants to protect Bella's virtue, as well as several conversations that the teenage girls in Meyer's series have about their experiences of periods, which is also a conversation I will return to later. However, Twilight also addresses the Gothic specter of birth quite explicitly in a way that is unusual in young adult literature. I would posit that this is at least partially because Twilight is not just a young adult Gothic novel, but a Mormon Gothic as well. In Meyer's cultural background and in the moral world that her characters occupy, sex is reserved for married couples, and marriage happens when the characters are still teenagers, 18 for Bella and 17 for Edward, respectively. Twilight, then, bridges some of the traditional gaps between the teenage Gothic and the horror of female sexual maturity, and the matrophobic and female Gothic and the specter of birth that are seen in adult Gothic novels. Gothic mothers and their many supernatural forms are especially interesting in a Mormon context, with a background of absent mothers, missing mothers, and monstrous mothers in Gothic literature for children firmly established. I'll take another moment to reflect on why this is especially interesting for Mormon readers and writers. In modern Mormonism, broadly speaking, all women are constructed as mothers in a similar way to the matrophobic Gothic. But there is a mother who is notably missing from Mormonism's many, many mothers, specifically God the Mother. In 1980, Linda Wilcox Desamore described Heavenly Mother as, quote, shadowy and elusive, floating around the edges of Mormon consciousness, almost like the many Gothic mothers of literature. Whether Mormons imagine her as excised from daily LDS doctrine, a specter in the margins of LDS theology, or believe, as others have argued, that she is the Holy Ghost, Mormonism is, to borrow Carolyn Pearson's phrasing, a motherless house. And a motherless house is inherently a haunted house as well. So I've just spent 8 minutes telling you that there are missing mothers in Twilight and moments in which women in Twilight are denied children. But now I want to talk about specifics. Twilight starts with Bella moving out of her mother, Renee's home, because her mother is no longer available to her. This is because Renee has gotten married to a man who, the text emphasizes, is younger, and Renee, quote, does not like spending nights away from her new husband, which I will allow you all to interpret for yourself. Renee's open sexual interest thrusts Bella out of the safety of her human mother's care and into Forks, Washington, a quintessentially Gothic small town covered by mist and populated by vampires. But Bella is not the only character who found herself in Forks, in part because of a mother who has disappeared. In Midnight Sun, a newly published addition to the Twilight Saga, which tells the story of Twilight from Edward's perspective, Edward says that his mother is the only person he remembers clearly from his human life. To quote the whole passage, Edward says, I remember my mother most clearly and felt an ancient ache when I thought of her face. With the Mormon Gothic in mind, it seems like Edward, like Carolyn Pearson in her famous poem, might also be a child crying for his mother in the night. And for any psychoanalysts in the room, Edward brings up his yearning for his mother when he realizes he has fallen in love with Bella, experiencing truly deep affection for another person for the first time in his long, immortal life, telling readers that, quote, besides my mother's love, there was no other love that made him wish to be a human. So, both Edward and Bella find themselves in a romance, at least in part because two different mothers, 100 years apart, have not been able to be there for their children. Rosalie Cullen, Edward's adopted vampire sister, has a slightly different story. Of all Meyer's vampires, Rosalie is the one who resents being a vampire the most. In Eclipse, she explains to Bella that she hates her vampirism because she wants to be a mother, and vampire women cannot have children. When Rosalie was a human, she was engaged and excited to be married and start a family of her own, but her almost fiance murdered Rosalie during a brutal gang rape. It's one of the more graphic descriptions in Meyer's books. Rosalie's description of the end of her human life is the first, but not only when women are harmed or even killed at some point in the process of becoming pregnant, or in Rosalie's case, being forced to have sex. Rosalie also points out that while she got most of what she wanted as a human, a man she loves, beauty, and wealth, none of those factors were worth missing the opportunity to become a mother. Esme, who is Edward's vampire mother, is the most prominent mother in the series, and the only Cullen who is a parent at the beginning of the story. In another moment of tragedy associated with motherhood and birth, Esme attempted suicide after her baby died and was rescued when she was turned into a vampire. Twilight implies that because Esme misses her human child so much, she becomes an adoptive mother to the many Cullen teenagers, even though they are less than a decade younger than her. So, Esme becomes a mother, but the public explanation for the residents of Forks for her adoption of her vampire teenagers is that Esme, solely and specifically, has struggled with infertility. Interestingly, in another of Meyer's books, Life and Death, which is a gender-swapped version of Twilight, the adult Cullens also tell the town of Forks that they experience infertility. However, in Life and Death, it is the gender-swapped Dr. Corrine Cullen, rather than Esme's gender-swapped double, who has dealt with infertility. While arguably a minor detail, it feels significant that infertility throughout the Twilight saga is the responsibility of women. Perhaps in a parallel to Walter Scott's work, the horror of childlessness, at least for Rosalie and Esme, is a Gothic horror that only and specifically women can encounter. Which brings me to what I personally would call the most horrific moment in the Twilight saga, as well as possibly the most graphically disturbing scene in all of film history. This is perhaps a bit of an exaggeration. I am, of course, referring to Bella's pregnancy and complicated birth in Breaking Dawn. In terms of the process of Bella getting pregnant, I'm going to skip talking about the sex scene and the physical danger it puts Bella in, because other scholars like McGeo and Kane have discussed it at length, and I would definitely recommend their work. So for today, let me just remind you that Bella wakes up on her honeymoon, covered in bruises and thrilled by it, while Edward is horrified that sex is so dangerous. What I do want to highlight, however, is the difference between Edward and Rosalie as they go through the process of creating a child. Meyer provides the biological explanation that, for Rosalie, her vampire signaled the end of her period, and thus the end of her fertility, while Edward and his sperm apparently escaped that fate. This brings us back to Camille Buckley and her ideas of menarche and menstruation as a site of horror in young adult literature. In Twilight, it is instead the lack of these bodily processes that bring about the moments of horror. Science or lack thereof aside, this is yet another moment of placing infertility solely and specifically upon the women of Twilight. Male vampires could, and according to Breaking Dawn, do, have children with human women all the time. It's just that those women, those human women, tend to die. Which brings me to Bella. Her broken spine, her vampiric transformation, and friend Esme. Bella dies giving birth. Like, that is just a strange fact of the series, that the heroine dies giving birth. Her half-vampire child breaks her ribs and spine and rips Renesmee's way out of Bella's body using razor-sharp vampire teeth. It is incredibly disturbing. The moment of childbirth in the Twilight saga is the closest this series comes to indulging in the horror movie history of vampires and the Gothic more broadly. And Bella only survives because she is transformed into a more perfect creature, but simultaneously is only permitted to become a vampire, a deified, powerful, godlike creature in Meyer's world, once she has first become a mother, a phenomenon that ought to be familiar to Mormon readers who know the importance of both the divine father and mother. In essence, Bella becomes a mother and a semi-divine vampire at the same time, which I believe draws connections to both Mormon conceptions of the divine feminine and heavenly mother, as well as the role women occupy in Mormon ideas of an afterlife. Indeed, Bella, Edward, and Renesmee become a vampiric family. In the logic of Breaking Dawn, Bella and Edward are rewarded for their sexual virtue, their love, and their relationship, with the opportunity to not just be together as a couple forever, but to actually be the series' only true eternal family. Finally, I want to finish off this presentation by looking at two outliers of supernatural women who are not mothers and do not seem to yearn for motherhood in the same way that other characters do. First, Leah Clearwater, who is the only female werewolf. When Leah transforms into a werewolf, she, like Rosalie, stops having a period and worries to Jacob Black in Breaking Dawn that she might not be able to have children. Although she also confesses that she does not want them. It feels important when talking about Leah to recognize the parallels in her story to the forced sterilization of Indigenous women in the United States, as well as some of the amazing work by people like Pearson, Burke, and Ledvinka on the troubling ways Twilight presents Indigenous people. And if you're interested in this, I really would recommend looking into it further because it's wild. The other important part of Leah's story is that if Leah cannot be a mother, it is also implied that she cannot be a romantic interest within werewolf society. The characters of Twilight hypothesize that werewolves imprint or find their eternal soulmates with the individual who would be the best mates and provide the best genetic material to carry on werewolf lines. As such, Leah believes she cannot and will not imprint on anyone, so she remains unrequitedly in love with her high school boyfriend, who is now in love with someone else, as well as being stuck in eternal adolescence. By the end of Breaking Dawn, while most of the other characters have gotten happy endings and found true love and family, Leah's story, her inability to have children, and her heartbreak are not rectified. Finally, I want to talk about some of the bad guys of the Twilight Saga. Among the villains, there are also women. Unlike the Cullens, their rival coven, the Volturi, do not structure their organization as a family. Instead, the ancient Italian vampires live in the dark basement of an Italian church, led by three men, Ero and his two counselors, Caius and Marcus. Ero, Caius, and Marcus, however, are also often accompanied by three silent shadows, called simply the wives. The Volturi present women who are not mothers and are solely defined not by their connection to children, but by their connection to men. It is also troubling how similar the structure of the Volturi look to the modern structure of the LDS Church. A sole leader, two counselors, and three silent wives who accompany their husbands, but do not rule. If Bella and Edward offer an idealized version of eternal parenthood and divine families, the Volturi offer the darker side of the modern LDS Church structure for women in their role, destined to follow, alone, and constantly standing behind men. In summary, the tropes of Gothic classics such as the female Gothic and the matrophobic Gothic become especially interesting in the context of modern Mormon constructions of gender, romance, and Heavenly Mother. I believe these interactions could potentially form the foundation of a way to talk about a Mormon Gothic for young people and the unique ways in which mothers and daughters in Mormon literature construct their relationships. I've demonstrated this by talking about some of the most interesting mothers of the Twilight Saga, but I think this framework could apply equally well and be very interesting for other young adult fantasy novels by Mormon writers. And I know I have just provided a huge number of examples of how motherhood functions in the story of Twilight. So I think I owe you a moment at the end of this presentation to try to make motherhood's meaning coherent in the context of the Mormon Gothic for young people, specifically in Twilight. However, I do not think I can do that. Throughout Twilight, mothers are dealt with in so many disparate ways. Their abandonment causes trauma and true love with similar frequency. They are exalted and condemned in equal measure. Every behavior by a mother is questioned and endowed with moral value. Women who are mothers are culpable for their flaws in parenting, and women who are not mothers are otherized and made monstrous. Most importantly, perhaps, mothers are given responsibility, blame, and guilt, no matter how they appear in the story. This, perhaps, is the most Mormon part of this Mormon Gothic for adolescents. I spoke earlier about how the LDS Church is both a religion where every single woman is supposed to embody the divine virtue of motherhood. And yet the mother who ought to be the pinnacle exemplar of that virtue is hidden away, turned into a ghost in a haunted, motherless house of the modern church. As such, it seems like a reasonable enough conclusion to believe that the implicit incoherence of LDS doctrine on mothers would replicate itself in this matrophobic genre. And that is perhaps the scariest part of the story. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Emma. I put the three of you together because it seemed to work, but I am very excited about how we're seeing all these different aspects of horror in the Gothic, and we are going to talk about that after Conor goes. So you're up next, Conor.
All right. Okay. Okay, cool. So let us liken the best books unto ourselves, towards and expansive Mormon literary criticism. In 1999, luminaries of Mormon literary criticism like Eugene England, Gideon Burton, Neil Kramer, and others gathered together for a special issue of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, dedicated entirely to Mormon literary criticism, setting the stage for a revival and new vigorous engagement with Mormon literary criticism. But there has yet to be another special issue of Dialogue about literary criticism. This is not to say that nothing has happened in Mormon literary criticism between 1999 and today, but to illustrate that the revival, even restoration of Mormon criticism that Burton and others called for has yet to fully come to pass. I hope today to join and extend that conversation that Burton and others held in 1999 about what Mormon literary criticism should be and should look like, and perhaps, God willing, play some part in the ongoing project of restoration. I propose that to effect Zion and to gather and expound truth, we need a Mormon literary criticism that uses Mormonism to interpret all texts and allows those texts to speak to our Mormonism and be changed by that encounter. My remarks today offer a theoretical and theological foundation for such a view of Mormon literary criticism, considering some of the affordances and dangers of such an approach, and ends with a gesture outward to the types of readings that may fit within this theoretical framework. To some extent, I have been doing these sorts of readings my entire life. Discussions with my dad about deathbed repentance inspired by Return of the Jedi, identifying Christ figures in Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Transformers, and elsewhere, and most recently, thinking about theosis in N.K. Jemison's The 100,000 Kingdoms. And I'm not alone. John Tanner's classic essay, Making a Mormon of Milton, operates in this vein alongside work from Eric Jepson, much of the criticism on the blog Ships of Haggoth, the general approach of Liz Busby's new podcast, Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, and last year's essay collection, Mormonism in the Movies, from BCC Press. Not to mention countless testimonies, anecdotes, and offhand comments from friends and family that Mormon a text, to borrow Laura Craner's phrase from a 2008 Motley Vision blog post. So on what grounds can, and I argue should, we engage in this type of criticism? In 1854, John Taylor wrote, "If there is any truth in heaven, earth, or hell, I want to embrace it. I care not what shape it comes into me, who brings it, who believes in it, whether it is popular or unpopular, truth, eternal truth, I wish to float in and enjoy." Then, Elder Taylor reminds us that Mormonism is truth, no matter where it is found. As Gideon Burton and others have argued, truth can be found in literature. Indeed, Matthew Wickman, English professor at BYU, a personal mentor and friend, writes in his recent spiritual memoir, thinking about the Doctrine and Covenants verse about the best books, that discussion of this passage often hinges on what these best books are. But I am most compelled by what these books do. Learning from the best books is necessary, we read, because all have not faith. That is, the best books serve as bridges to spiritual lessons we might learn in some other way. The implication is that truth is diffused across our experience, with the best books capturing and presenting it in richer clusters, making it more apparent and appealing to us. In this respect, these books serve as surrogates for the Holy Ghost, guiding us into all truth and showing us things to come. Matt reminds us here that the purpose of seeking out the best books is to learn lessons and to gather some of the truth that has been diffused throughout heaven, earth, and hell, as John Taylor suggests. To find and gather these truths, to build faith from reading these best books, we need a Mormon literary criticism. The Book of Mormon prophet Nephi calls on us to liken scripture unto ourselves. Joe Spencer persuasively explores how Nephi himself models this principle of likening in his prophetic engagement with Isaiah. Spencer highlights the ways in which Nephi recognizes the specific Jewish context of Isaiah's prophecies and puts them to a new use and meaning related to Nephi's own particular context. This is what I believe a Mormon literary criticism must do. In some sense, this is a variation on what Burton lays out in his discussion of Richard Craycroft and Bruce Jorgensen, the fidelity to the Mormon ethos and openness to otherness. as the two complementary, if somewhat paradoxical, values that should guide Mormon criticism. Literary theory offers a slightly different angle of approaching this likening of texts. Rita Felsky, in The Limits of Critique, argues that, quote, sometimes serious thinking calls for a judicious decrease rather than an increase of distance, a willingness to acknowledge and more fully engage our attachments, close quote. This is part of what I think is necessary for a Mormon literary criticism, thinking critically and deeply about why I personally am attached to certain texts and their themes to interrogate what about them tastes delicious, as it were. Felsky also suggests that, quote, we might place ourselves in front of the text, reflecting on what it unfurls, calls forth, makes possible, all as part of recognizing the text's status as co-actor, as something that makes a difference, that helps make things happen. For Felsky, meaning is found and created by paying close attention to our attachments to literature and the ways that literary texts move us. Felsky's work here is influenced by Bruno Latour's object-oriented ontology, which strikes me as being quite similar to some interpretations of Mormon doctrine of intelligences, specifically from Orson Pratt and other similar thinkers. All of these pieces put together bring me to something that Mark Noll has termed novelistic theology. Noll initially developed this term in his work on Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I've used it elsewhere, notably in my master's thesis on James Hogg's The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. In essence, novelistic theology is grounded in particulars and personal experience, which confound the strictures and dogmas of a systematic theology. Novelistic theology uses the lives and stories of characters to complicate, stretch, and render lived theological principles that would otherwise remain abstract. Novelistic theology allows us as readers to remember that the text we read should speak to our theology as much as our theology should speak to these best books. Essentially, novelistic theology is less interested in certainty than practicality. It cares about complicated stories and believes that those stories reveal something about God, something we as readers can discern through careful reading. Scripture, perhaps especially uniquely Mormon scripture, demonstrates this point. I'm not making a claim here about the historicity or fictitious nature of scripture, but instead drawing on some of Grant Hardy's work on the Book of Mormon. Hardy argues that if the Book of Mormon is a work of fiction, it is more intricate and clever than has heretofore been acknowledged. And although there is some truth to the charge of didacticism often leveled against it, the fact that everything is deeply embedded in narrative makes it rather more interesting. Narratives are always susceptible to multiple interpretations. Hardy's point here is twofold. First, the Book of Mormon is narratively complex. And second, narratives always allow for multiple interpretations. That this uniquely Mormon scripture is, as Hardy notes, a carefully constructed artifact, suggests to me that there's a power in using stories and narratives to learn about God. With novelistic theology, we can explore some other complicated stories from the best books, placing them in conversation with our Mormonism to expound truth. And this line of thinking echoes a call to the church from Brother B.H. Roberts at the turn of the last century. Brother B.H. discussed two types of disciples, praising a second sort that expound, reveal truth, doing more than simply regurgitating truths and principles, but seeking to develop and enlarge the truths of Mormonism. He says that the disciples of Mormonism, growing discontented with the necessarily primitive methods which have hitherto prevailed in sustaining the doctrine, will yet take profounder and broader views of the great doctrines committed to the church, and departing from mere repetition will cast them in new formulas, cooperating in the works of the Spirit until they help to give to the truths received a more forceful expression and carry it beyond the earlier and cruder stages of its development. If, as Brother B.H. says, we need disciples to expound truth, then the understanding that we have of truth is that it is limited and incomplete, which the Articles of Faith certainly suggest is the case. Brother B.H. calls then for all of us as Mormon disciples to do something about this. And I believe that one answer to this call is for the Mormon critic to go to heaven, earth, and hell, seeking out the best books and gathering the truths in them, reading them as Mormon literature, with Mormonism speaking to these literary texts and the literary texts speaking to our Mormonism. We can cast truths in new formulas, help to give to the truths received a more forceful expression. And such bold frontiers bring dangers with them. I see three main pitfalls that Mormon critics undertaking the criticism that I've outlined thus far should be wary of. First, proof texting. Second, warping truth. And third, instrumentalizing texts. These pitfalls are certainly not unique to the type of criticism I'm advocating for, but they are certainly real dangers. Yet, I believe that a proper engagement of the sort of Mormon literary criticism that I call for will help us avoid these pitfalls. The key to avoiding these and other pitfalls that I haven't mentioned is twofold, I think. First, to ground our criticism and analysis in the text itself. And second, to ensure that the text and Mormonism speak to each other. Embracing this approach and ethos to Mormon literary criticism recognizes that the best books can aid us in expounding the truths of Mormonism in a way that builds faith. If we fail to do these two things, we are certainly in danger of the three cautions I identified. Proof texting occurs when we take bits and pieces of a text to advance an argument that we have developed prior to finishing or reading any of the text. Many people that engage in a sort of folk literary criticism along the lines I have proposed do this. It's a time-honored and long-standing tradition of how to engage with scripture. And it distorts the text, preventing us from accessing the truths it may reveal. To avoid this, we need to consider passages and moments in their full narrative and literary context before we liken them unto ourselves. If we do not fully understand the text on its own terms, which may include leaning into historical context or other such factors, but doesn't always need to, how can we hope to appropriately render that text Mormon? Often, I encounter proof texting that occurs for various ideological purposes, but to do so lacks the necessary epistemic humility that Mormon literary critics need. We must recognize that truth is truth, and if we find ourselves ignoring elements of the text or twisting their meaning in pursuit of truth, perhaps we are serving something else. This difficulty of assessing whether we are truly pursuing truth or something else contributes to the second pitfall, warping truth. This is a double danger. When we put Mormonism in conversation with any given text, we risk warping truths from Mormonism and warping truths from the text. Whereas proof texting largely occurs by cherry-picking textual evidence to support a preconceived conclusion, warping truth can be more subtle, occurring at almost any stage of the analysis. If we are engaged in the expounding of truth and doctrine that Brother BH calls us to, then this is almost inevitable. To avoid warping truth and to correct any warping that I think will and has occurred, we must practice fidelity to the texts we are analyzing and to Mormonism. And importantly, the Mormon critic must exercise caution and humility, inviting and encouraging engagement with their ideas. In essence, a Eugene England-esque critical dialogue about the text, as it were. The failure to do this may result in the third pitfall, instrumentalizing the text. Here, I mean simply using the text as a means to an end, rather than something that is engaged on its own terms. This may manifest most commonly as a sort of apologetic reading, a Mormon reading of a text that serves to simply affirm Mormonism or some truth from Mormonism, where the value of the text becomes its evidence for that outside goal or argument. Mormon folk readings of C.S. Lewis are often a blend of this sort of instrumentalizing and proof texting. Leaning into novelistic theology is one of the key ways to avoid this, to recognize that the whole point of reading and likening these best books unto ourselves is to be transformed by them, to wrestle with the complications and tensions and gaps between the world as we understood it and the world as the text understands it. So finally, as promised, let's gesture towards some of the readings that I think are made possible within this theoretical framework. First, as I mentioned at the top, an analysis of N.K. Jemison's The 100,000 Kingdoms, which I've actually already written for a special issue of SFRA that Adam McLean edited, which focuses on theosis and polygamy, thinking about what Jemison's novel suggests about theosis and the way it does and doesn't fit neatly within a traditional Mormon framework. Second, a reading of Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang alongside Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-5 that considers time and the nature of God. Third, an analysis of Jane Austen's Persuasion, which explores class and social divides in relation to marriage, suggesting that one possible Mormon parallel is interfaith marriages, which happens to be the first piece of Mormon literary criticism that I wrote at BYU. Fourth, a reading of Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell that considers relationships and eternity and time and the ways that all of those intersect and interact with one another, perhaps grounded in the teaching in the Doctrine and Covenants that that same sociality which exists among us here will exist among us there, only it will be coupled with eternal glory. And finally, an analysis of Lloyd Alexander's Westmark trilogy that focuses on the limitations and realities of the 12th Article of Faith, considering the injunction for moderation in all things, and perhaps a reading alongside the story of Alma the Younger and the Sons of Mosiah that pays close attention to the realities of redemption. And these are just a taste of the types of readings that this sort of expansive Mormon literary criticism makes possible. An expansive Mormon criticism can draw on Mormonism in the most broadly conceived sense. Mormon scriptural texts, theological ideas and principles, doctrines, practices, cultural elements, draw from mainstream fundamentalists and any other expression of Mormonism that there is. And while I've focused primarily on the value of this approach to include literature that falls outside the traditional Mormon literature umbrella, we can and should practice this sort of literary criticism with explicitly Mormon texts as well, which we have seen here today. And I believe that a Mormon literary criticism that does what I've sketched out today, that pays attention to what texts unfurl, call forth, and make possible, that likens all of the best books unto ourselves, that remains faithful to a Mormon ethos and open and generous to the stranger, can transform Mormonism and us along with it. Thank you.
Thanks, Conor. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Renan. This has been, my mind's just full of thoughts right now. So clearly you've all hit on some very interesting things. So here's what I want to do. I have one comment that I want to make about a work of vampire literature. While I'm doing that, all of you have experience with either the horror or the Gothic. And I'd be interested in hearing a work or two by, kind of in the spirit of Conor's essay or presentation, a work or two by a non-Mormon writer that you think would be of interest to Mormon literary critics, Mormon readers, and or Mormon fiction writers. So if you could just kind of think about, and if you don't have one, that's fine, but one or two works that are either horror or Gothic that are not part of Mormon literature, but that might be interesting to those who are writing, Mormon writers of horror and Gothic, Mormon readers of horror and Gothic, or Mormon critics of horror and the Gothic. And obviously I know that the horror and the Gothic are not one and the same, they're different genres, but they also are kind of interrelated. So here's the comment that I wanted to make, which is last year I contributed an essay to the edition of Ariantum that Natalie Brown edited, focused on Zion and home. And I talked about haunted homes and kind of when heaven on earth, or when homes are not heaven on earth. And one of the texts that I used for that is a vampire novel that is not quite as well known as Stephanie Meyer's Twilight Saga, and is not YA. It's Angel Falling Softly by Eugene Woodbury. And thinking both about Emma's amazing framework, and then also thinking about Renan's look at kind of how vampires have been interpreted in Brazilian literature. Two interesting things are found in that text. One is that the way Eugene Woodbury talks or makes a place for vampires to exist inside a kind of a Mormon worldview, kind of creates a scientistic approach to vampires, makes me think that it would be interesting to take a look at kind of all the Mormon vampire stories and how they talk about the mechanics, the culture, the being, the drinking of blood within the context of Mormonism, Mormon theology, Mormon folklore, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thought. The other thought is that Angel Falling Softly, and I know, Emma, that you're focused on YA. is about mothers and a child, very much so. And so I'm now thinking about kind of the way that you talk about the Gothic in relation to Mormonism and Mormon feminism. And Angel Falling Swiftly is written by a cisgender male, but and has, how do I put this? I said it more artfully in the essay, but it has some interesting things about it, but also has some things about it that where it's clearly was written by a cisgender male. And so kind of interrogating that aspect of Angel Falling Softly beyond kind of the little bit that I did in my essay would be, I think, very interesting. So just a thought that occurred to me, and the fact that there are a lot of interesting vampire text out there in Mormon literature, and I know that there's been a lot of Stephanie Meyer's scholarship, and what I love about Emma's contribution is that it's made me, it goes deeper into the text and deeper into Mormonism, I think, than a lot of the stuff that I personally encountered, which was awesome. All right, so now if any of you go ahead and just like unmute, chime in. Are there any works by non-Mormon writers that are either horror or Gothic that you think would be of interest to kind of the community of Mormon letters? Anybody want to?
I am always willing to jump in with a book recommendation.
Awesome.
So I do children's literature, so I'm about to do 2 children's books as recommendations. One is the Crush and Crave series by Tracy Wolfe. I will preface this with, there are differences between good literature and literature that's really fun to read, and this is definitely fun to read. But it builds on a lot of the themes of Twilight, but from a very non-LDS, non-Mormon perspective. I think it is interesting for Mormons who do Twilight criticism specifically, but also just vampires, to read some completely non-LDS text, because I think something I see a little bit too frequently is Twilight will be the main text in Mormon literary criticism about vampires, or we will talk about Mormon vampires. It's like, there are other people talking about this too, and those differences are fascinating to observe. And then the other one, this is a Gothic children's series that got very famous. The series of Unfortunate Events is now getting a lot of attention in the field of children's literature studies, and especially religious children's literature studies, because it is a Jewish series that is very subtly Jewish. And Judaism has a fascinating history with vampires and the Gothic specifically. And that series does a lot of really interesting stuff with that. And it's super worth revisiting because it holds up 20 years later.
Awesome. Anybody else want to chime in?
Well, thinking in a non-Mormon writer, I remember, I think that I need to mention a Brazilian writer, and I think that Machado de Assis is the name that I didn't have to mention, because he was a very complete writer. He wrote chronicles, poems, novels, and is considered the most important Brazilian writer. He described the Brazilian society at the time very well, and much of that he said is true to this day. It has passed more than a century, then he died, but it is a time that the church is not here in Brazil, but is yet a very important to comprehend Brazilian culture, and I think that is a good author to read.
Yeah. So we'll go, we're gonna go way back, because that's where all my academic reading is. So first is James Hogg's The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, which was published 1824, I think. It's fascinating, and just doing really interesting things with the tensions between a sort of like zealous religious life and a more like rational, empirical, enlightenment type of way of viewing the world, and sort of pits those two against each other, and then refuses to fully resolve that tension in a way that I think is really provocative, and I think speaks to some like a slant interesting stuff about Mormonism. And then it's grappling with a lot of other religious ideas, specifically tied to like Scottish Calvinism. So that's the first. The second, this is probably, you could do, I think, some interesting Mormon readings of it, thinking about time and what Gothic time is doing in the text. But it's mostly just a blast to read in a sort of perverse way, like a lot of Gothic texts. It's Matthew Lewis's The Monk, which is just bonkers and wild. And every time you think it has like escalated as much as it can, it proves you wrong and escalates to a new level of like depravity and wildness. And I think, I guess 2 points, I guess, of interest for Mormon readers. One would be sort of like thinking about what a like fully converted like religious life is, and how you misconceptions of what that is may make you more prone to a fall from that position. And the second, sort of like I mentioned earlier, is just how structurally the book is thinking about time and is doing like weird stuff with how you're like moving between a bunch of different timelines, and things seem to exist like sort of out of joint in the Hamlet Gothic time sense that scholars like Jesse Molesworth have talked about. But yeah.
Thanks, Connor. Kurt Madsen has asked in the chat, and I don't know that what he's asked is not necessarily in any of your remit. So if you have something, let me know, but I can also talk a little bit about this, which is, has anyone done an analysis of Lovecraftian horror and Mormonism? For example, the evidence of a beyond that is both incomprehensible and powerful. I would say that certainly Steve Peck's work, especially The Short Stay in Hell, relate to that. I don't know that there's been a lot of analysis of that work. I'd also remind, I don't know how well known his work is in Mormon literary circles. We feature it on A Motley Vision, but and he appears in Monsters and Mormons, the book, the anthology that Eric Jepson and I edited. But Willem Pugmire is a very interesting cultural figure, both in terms of Mormonism, but especially in terms of the world of Lovecraft. And he wrote a lot of stories that are in the Lovecraftian tradition. Only one of them has a direct Mormon reference, and that was been republished in Monsters and Mormons. But I'd be interested to see if some of his other work could perhaps speak to that idea of Mormon characters or Mormon sensibilities in relation to Lovecraft. So anybody else have anything they want to?
I don't know of like readings, but I think another writer that works in that space, DJ Butler, does some Lovecraftian things. I think most of his more Lovecraftian stories are also less explicitly Mormon, but there's intersections there that are probably worth looking at if you're interested in that.
Awesome. Okay, now I have a question for you that I would like each of the members of the panel to address. One of my particular hobby horses when it comes to the world of Mormon literature is Mormon criticism. I want to see more Mormon criticism happen, which is why I'm very happy about what happened in this panel today and what's going to be happening in our next panel, which is coming up at noon Mountain Time. And so I know that fiction writers hate this question, which is, where do you get your ideas? But I'm hoping that you all would maybe be a bit more amenable to that question in the context of literary criticism, and especially in the way I'm going to formulate this, which is, what were you reading and thinking about, and maybe even talking about with others? What were the things, the text, the ideas, the moments in your life that led to the ideas that made it into your presentation? Kind of if you could just give us a little bit of a behind the scenes of your process. And if we could kind of go in the same order of the panel, that would be great. So Renan, if you wanted to start.
Well, I am a fan of Stephanie Meyer, and I read all of her books. And because of it, I started to read and watch movies about vampires. I love it. And because of it, I wrote this tale and started to think, well, if it's possible to other members of the church here in Brazil, have wrote something like that. And I found these other three authors. I talked with them, and I found that have other people who have interest in this same and are planning to publish other books about that. And that's led me to wrote this presentation, and I found it very interesting. I believe that's that.
Emma?
Yeah, so my focus on Mormon children's literature mostly comes from being in a children's literature program that had absolutely nothing to do with Mormonism. But people like obviously Stephanie Meyer, but also Brandon Mull, Orson Scott Card, Virginia Sorensen would come up, and I found myself raising my hand in seminars all the time being like, this person's Mormon, and that does matter to their literature. Like, it's hard to fully understand these writers without at least considering their religious background. And I saw that people with other religious backgrounds had widely published, widely analyzed versions of the author's religious background. And I was not seeing that in the same way with Mormon children's literature. And then I personally love Gothic children's literature. I think it's fun and spooky. And so I love that there is also an entire field of Mormon writers who are writing Gothic books for children with intensely Mormon influences. Yeah, like check out Brandon Mull. His Fablehaven books are very weird and very Gothic and very fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Emma. Conor?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different points of genesis for this presentation. I think the most straightforward way to answer the question is I happened to be reading Jemison's The 100,000 Kingdoms at the same time as I was reading Sam Brown's book In Heaven as It Is on Earth, sort of talking about Joseph Smith and a way of like thinking about Joseph Smith's teachings in theology to like sort of bring them all together. And I just was struck by some of the ways that those were sort of speaking to some similar ideas and then some differences. And that's probably true of how I find my ideas a lot of the time, is just reading, watching, and engaging in media like in a very eclectic way. And then connections just sort of like pop up as I do that I find the connections that are most interesting, I think, when I'm not like actively working on any given project.
That has a way of happening also for writing fiction as well. Thanks everybody for your answers. We do have a question for Conor, but I'll just note, if you are watching this after the live stream has ended, make sure you turn on the live chat, because there's a lot of really interesting information going on in the live chat about Lovecraftian horror and Mormonism. But now a question for Conor from Gideon Burton. How would novelistic theology inform the work of Mormon creative writers, not just critics of Mormon literature?
That's a great question, Gideon. Thank you. I think it's some of the themes that were explored in Thursday night's conversation about Eugene, England. So I was thinking about the personal essay and other genres and how they have different strengths and weaknesses, and that one of the strengths of fiction, right, is this idea that the story is primary in your focus, not the message or theme. And And so I think an understanding of novelistic theology would be one where you I guess a way of thinking about it in a very like Mormon specific way would be to think about Joseph Smith's quote of that truth is manifest by proving contraries, that you would take two or more truths that create some tension or conflict, and then explore those in a story that remains true to those different truths, but does not, but lets the story sort of like just sit in that tension. So I think an understanding of that would hopefully allow creative writers to be comfortable with the tension that's created there, and not feel a need to try and resolve it, to recognize that what's valuable about novelistic theology is that it is not systematic, and that it does not like fully fit into some sort of like rational logical structure, that it lives in and celebrates those tensions.
Wait, so Mormons can write about like tension and have ambiguity in their work, and maybe even write tragedy? Sorry, I just had to throw that in there. Okay. To wrap up, I would like it, not to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot. I'd like each of you to, and again, we'll go in the same order as the panel order, to tell me something that you are working on or hope to work on. Doesn't even have to be related to Mormon literature, but something that you're interested in right now. It could be creative work, it could be academic work. And then an additional question for Renan is, for any of viewers who are interested in the books that you mentioned, and can read in Portuguese or Spanish, are there ways for those of us outside of Brazil to acquire those books?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, for anyone outside of Brazil who can read in Spanish or Portuguese, is there any way for us to acquire the books that you mentioned in your presentation?
Well, I don't think that we have translation to English, but the books of Raphael and Elise, and I believe that Christian also are in Amazon, so you can buy it by there. And my story is in a digital book, is available in PDF, so you can find it in Google. It's easy to find it.
Awesome. And then the next question is what are you working on? What's next for you in relation to the world of literature?
Well, about vampirism, and it's not linked with Mormonism, I'm thinking and write a story of vampires, but it's not like this that I mentioned. It's more a traditional vampire. Also in this fictional country that I named Ethan, I take this name from the Book of Ether in the Book of Mormon. I love that strange names there. And for now, this is my literary project. And also we have an association for Brazilian writers that are members of the church, and I'm working with them to know each other, read what the others are working, and it is marvelous. I like it very much.
Awesome. Emma?
So in terms of my Mormon studies stuff, I'm doing my PhD in this, but my next project is integrating this Mormon Gothic for young people idea to Brandon Mull's Fablehaven and his Candy Shop Wars, as well as April and Pike's Wings series, which I think is a deeply underrated series. It's very fun. Then outside of the world of Mormon studies, I have an article coming out on the queer cyborgs in the first edition illustrations of Frank L. Baum's Oz series, coming out in the next couple of months. So if you want to read about some queer robot drawings, stay tuned.
Excellent. Totally agree on wings. Conor?
So probably the next Mormon studies-y thing that I've got, I'm launching my Mormon Wilderness project on Sunday, if everything comes together today, which I've talked about some places, but it's basically trying to, it's like a website to make a space for people that claim Mormonism and feel like they don't fit in normal boxes, whether that's in any of the institutional churches or outside of them. So there'll be that on the internet soon if you're interested, or you can reach out to me wherever. And then my academic stuff next, I'm working on my prospectus for my dissertation, so that needs more of my attention than it has been getting. But yeah, so I'm sort of narrowing down the text that I'm going to focus on, and we'll see where that takes me.
Thank you so much, everybody. This has been a great session. I really appreciate the time and effort that you put in to the work. I love seeing the work of Mormon criticism grow. And we'll be back in a little under 10 minutes with our second session of the morning at noon Mountain Time. Thanks, everybody. See ya.